Few stories ignite passions and controversies like the story of the creation of the State of Israel, one of the few ethno-religious states in contemporary times. And few men were as involved in the founding of that Jewish state, which today is a nuclear power in the Middle East, as the politician and statesman Ben-Gurion, later known as David Ben-Gurion. Not only was he obsessed with the Zionist cause from an early age, but he also became the first head of state of the long-awaited Jewish state, founded in 1948, and its first prime minister, guiding it through those difficult and complex early years of existence. The story of Ben-Gurion is also the story of the State of Israel, as well as the story of the irreversible displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes. Join us as we take a journey through this controversial history. This is Ronaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to support us by subscribing to the channel, liking this video, and leaving your comments, which we always read, by activating the bell, the notifications, and above all, by sharing it with all your friends on social media, on WhatsApp, and anywhere else. Without anything else to add, let's start with today's video. David Ben-Gurion was originally born with the name David Gruen on October 16, 1886 in Plonsk, a small town located in the north-central part of Poland, which at that time was under the rule of the Russian Empire of the Romanov dynasty. During his childhood in Plonsk, which had a considerable Jewish population at that time, David received his first lessons about the Jewish religion and the Hebrew language in the so-called heders, a kind of Jewish elementary schools, where children were taught things like the proper practice of Judaism, mastery of the Hebrew language, and the traditions of the Jewish people. Biographers point out that David interrupted his studies at that local Jewish school at the age of 13 in 1999 because the young man was not fond of the rigorous religious studies characteristic of Jewish education in that place. In fact, throughout his life, David never considered himself a believer or a practitioner of Judaism. He himself commented that at that young age, he was rather unreligious and even somewhat atheist. However, it is known that years later he would embrace pantheism, a doctrine in which the universe, nature, and the God of monotheistic religions are considered as a single divine entity. Although he has practiced very little of the religion and customs of his people, to understand David's life, it is necessary to take a quick look at the history of the Jews and the so-called Zionist movement, which was beginning to gain strength in those turbulent times for the Jews and for the world. According to their religious texts, the history of the Jewish people begins with the covenant between the God Yahweh and the patriarch Abraham, who has promised that he will be the father of a great nation, whose descendants will inherit the land of Canaan, located in the southwest of the so-called Fertile Crescent, which at that time was inhabited by other Semitic peoples, such as the Canaanites, the Philistines, and the Phoenicians. This Abrahamic patriarchal line continues with Isaac and with Jacob, who is renamed by God himself, Yahweh, as Israel, becoming the father, according to biblical texts, of the famous 12 tribes of Israel that would give rise to the Jewish people. According to archaeology, these Jewish tribes started as nomads. They would have arrived in Canaan around the year 1400 before Christ, and adopting several of their forms of government and religious customs. By the 11th century before Christ, the Jewish tribes unified politically, forming the Kingdom of Israel, which after the death of King Solomon in 931 before Christ, was divided into the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. These Jewish kingdoms, however, soon disappeared after being conquered by new peoples and new empires. And the region called Israel by the Jews, but Palestine by the Philistines and other groups, ended up passing through the hands of several different peoples who ruled over it. The last ancient empire to conquer this region was the Roman Empire in the year 63 before Christ. That was the year when the Romans established the province of Judea there, where years later the prophet Jesus of Nazareth was born. A crucial event for human history, for Jewish history, and even for the story we are telling today. Several decades later, the Jews rebelled against Rome in the so-called Judeo-Roman Wars of 66 before Christ and 136 AD, which culminated in the destruction of the famous Second Jewish Temple. With the gradual expulsion of the leading groups of those Jewish peoples from that territory, and with the change of the province's name from Judea to the province of Syria-Palestina, leaving Palestine as the main name by which that region would be called. At least for the next 1,800 years, a significant portion of the Jewish people continued living in that region. The Jewish-Roman Wars of the year 136 AD marked the beginning of the historic diaspora of Jewish tribes around the world, who mainly settled in Europe during the Middle Ages. For its part, the land of Palestine or Israel, depending on who you ask, passed through several empires until it was conquered by the Ottoman Empire in 1517. So by 1870, the population of the Ottoman province of Palestine was nearly 400,000 people, and it was made up of about 85% Palestinian Muslim population, 11% Palestinian Christians, and 4% Jewish population. In the last few centuries, those three groups had lived together in that region in a relatively peaceful way. Now, during these same years, at the end of the 19th century, what is known as political Zionism emerged, led by the Hungarian Jew Theodor Herzl. Zionism quickly became popular among the Jewish diaspora. This movement was supported by influential Jews all over the world, who in turn were in good favor with the elites of countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, like the prominent banking family Rothschild. The historical capital of the province of Palestine was Jerusalem, considered a holy land by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And this land, where almost 3,000 years ago there was a kingdom of Israel that lasted about 2 centuries, was the land that many Zionists saw as the preferred place for the task of establishing a new Jewish state. So the Zionist movement began to promote mass migrations of Jews to the Palestinian territory known as Aliyah. And between the late 19th century and 1904, therefore, they managed to move about 30,000 Jews to Palestine. These Jewish groups, for the most part, began forming their own towns and communities, as autonomous as possible. One of them would be called Tel Aviv, founded in 1909, which in its first decade had fewer than 2,000 inhabitants. Now, this migration movement of Jews began to generate tensions with the Palestinian population, both Muslim and Christian, particularly the Muslims, who were the majority. They see it as an existential threat. That new religious group, which came with the express intention of colonizing that territory and establishing a new Jewish state there to govern that land, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, Muslims, and some Catholics already lived. So even in these first decades, conflict began to arise. And were there the first clashes between the Palestinians and the Jews who were settling in the region? This is the historical transition full of uncertainty and controversy. In this period, the young Ben-Gurion, although still very young, makes his way into the ranks of the so-called Zionist project, beginning what would become his political career. David's family in particular is an important part of the Zionist movement in the town of Plonsk in Poland. His father was one of the most active members of the local Zionist society. Called Love of Zion, David soon becomes fascinated by the influence of Zionism from a very young age, expressing early on his desire to go live in Palestine. The first seeds of his Zionism sprout at the age of 14, when he and 2 friends found a youth club where they promote the use of Zionism. Members become typical members. See partially the calendars of what? Years later, in 1904, the same year of Theodor Herzl's death, David, already 18 years old, seriously plans to emigrate to Palestine. Although he first goes to Warsaw, where he tries to obtain a degree at the Mechanical Technical School, which he tries to enter several times, but without success. success. He does, however, obtain a position as a Hebrew teacher. Has the history of the 1936 Russian Revolution, 1905, the first spark of what would become the Russian Revolution of 1917, become a limit? He founded in Warsaw the Zion Workers' Party, which proposed a mixture of Marxism and Zionism, and David immediately joins it, participating in clandestine activities that briefly land him in prison. Twice released from jail by 1906, David has already gained experience in various aspects of activism and political militancy. He finally decides to immigrate to Palestine, landing in the town of Jaffa, very close to Tel Aviv, which was becoming the unofficial capital of the Jewish diaspora. After this, David moves to the Jewish settlement of Petah Tikva in the center-west of Palestine, where he dedicates himself to agriculture. It's not easy for him, as he contracts malaria, and sometimes the yield of the land was so poor that it wasn't even enough for him to eat, a very common condition among the first Jewish settlements at that time. Soon, David is called again to Jaffa to participate in the founding of the Palestinian branch of the Zion Workers' Party, the same one that had originated in Warsaw. At this meeting, David, already with a very good reputation, is chosen to chair the Central Committee in the dictatorship sessions. Reputation. Suddenly, David and his companions begin to have disagreements about the party's plans for a supposed union between the Arab Palestinian proletariat and the Jewish one. This was an idea that Ben-Gurion did not support, and these disagreements lead him to have an unstable relationship with the party, gradually distancing himself from direct political activity. Thus, around this time, David moves between Jaffa, Petah Tikva, and other agricultural settlements, such as Kfar Saba and Rishon. He left moving in 1907 to Sejera, which was at the far north of Palestine, to work as a farmer. Later, in 1909, David is invited by his party to be part of a new Zionist newspaper. He moved for this purpose to Jerusalem, which, as the seat of ancient Judaism and the Temple of Solomon, had become the center and almost a base of operations for the Zionist movement in Jerusalem, under Ottoman rule, let us remember, at that time. David adopts the name by which he would be known from then on, David Ben-Gurion. He chose this name in honor of a Jewish military leader who had rebelled against the Romans several centuries earlier. Thus, David Ben-Gurion made clear his vision to boldly lead the Zionist cause by 1911. However, witnessing the rising tensions and conflicts between Arabs, Palestinians, and the newly arrived Jews, inspired also by the decision made by several of his friends, Ben-Gurion moved with his father's support to Constantinople, which was then the capital of the Ottoman Empire. He moved there to study law using a forged high school diploma to do so. However, shortly after, in 1914, over in distant Europe where he once lived, what became known as the First World War broke out, which would also have significant consequences in the region of Palestine. By 1915, due to his Zionist activities, the Ottoman government deported Ben-Gurion to Egypt, from where he departed, to New York, a city that was already one of the nerve centers of Judaism worldwide. And there he planned to recruit a militia of Jews to support the United Kingdom in the war efforts. The British Empire was a key ally of the Zionist movement and also had interests in the Palestinian lands under Ottoman Empire possession, an empire with which it was at war. And although he didn't manage to form this militia, he did become very well known in the United States as a prominent leader of the Zionist Labor Party in the United States. He also meets the woman who would soon become his wife and the mother of his children, named Paula Moonways, a Russian Jew, just like him, who had immigrated to New York at a very young age. While David Ben-Gurion was in New York, the United Kingdom was fiercely fighting the Ottoman Empire in Palestine. And while this is happening, the ruling class of the British Empire pushes forward the controversial Balfour Declaration on November 2, 1917. This declaration was a letter signed by the British Foreign Minister, addressed to Baron Lionel Balfour Rothschild, a member of that prominent banking family and representative of the Zionist cause in Great Britain. This letter was a formal and public statement by His Majesty's British government, in which Great Britain offered its approval and support for the establishment of a national home for the Jews in the Palestinian territory. This declaration, harshly criticized around the world, was quickly supported by several important figures of the Zionist cause in the United States, the United Kingdom, and all of Europe. After the Balfour Declaration, Ben-Gurion joined the 38th Battalion of the Jewish Legion of the British Army in 1918. Although when he arrives with the troops in Palestine, the territory had already been taken by the British, ending 400 years of uninterrupted Ottoman rule in that area. After the victory over the Ottomans, the British occupied the province of Palestine and the surrounding regions, until in 1920 they received approval from the League of Nations, the predecessor of the United Nations, for a new political entity under British rule. With the creation of this new state in Palestinian territory, which was the British Mandate of Palestine, and with the Balfour Declaration, the British drastically reshaped the geopolitics, not only of the region of Palestine, but of the entire Middle East. And now the Jews, like Ben-Gurion, start pulling the strings to increasingly accelerate the long-awaited creation of a state for the Jews. In that land, with the Mandate of Palestine established, that land was now governed by a great ally of the Zionist movement. And the main task of the British administration at first will be to allow the flourishing of the necessary institutions for the functioning of a future independent Jewish state. In that place, they promoted Jewish migration to that territory more regularly and openly, and tried to appease the interactions and conflicts between Jews and Palestinian Arabs. The relationship would become much more tense in the coming decades as Jewish migration to that place increased massively. By 1920, Ben-Gurion, at 34 years old, founded and became the first Secretary General of the Histadrut, or in Spanish, the General Federation of Workers of Israel, a labor union that quickly became a major economic, social, and even military force within the Palestine Mandate. As the head of the Histadrut, Ben-Gurion played a crucial role in consolidating the foundations of the future State of Israel. With support from the funding of the allies of the Zionist cause, he establishes companies, hospitals, schools, and service networks that provide employment and assistance to a large part of the growing Jewish community in Palestine. He also promotes the creation of agricultural settlements such as kibbutzim and moshavim, and he supports Jewish immigration with the open and explicit mission of displacing the Palestinian Arab population to consolidate the Jewish state there. By 1930, alongside the Secretariat of the Histadrut, Ben-Gurion becomes the leader of the party, Mapai, a new Israeli labor party that brings together the more moderate left-wing factions and soon becomes the preferred party among Jews in Palestine. As leader of Mapai, Ben-Gurion consolidates his power, unifying various leftist factions. Under his leadership, he transforms the party into the central pillar of Zionism. And at the same time, he establishes ties and connections with international socialist parties, with whom he weaves an important network of support for the Zionist cause. And by 1935, already with a strong leadership consolidated, Ben-Gurion leaves the Federation of Workers of Israel, as he is appointed by internal vote as the new president of the so-called Jewish Agency. The Jewish Agency, founded in 1929, was an organization considered the direct institutional predecessor of the Israeli state. It was recognized by the British administration and was increasingly taking on the functions of a de facto government and state. It was responsible for representing the Jewish people internationally and for managing various affairs of the Jewish community in Palestine, such as intelligence, economic planning, migration, and the organization of the emerging Jewish military forces, like the Haganah, which functioned as a Zionist militia for the protection of the interests of the Jewish people, especially in their growing conflicts and confrontations with the Palestinian Arab people of the region. The reality is that since that land passed from Ottoman to British hands in 1919, Jewish migration to Palestine increased exponentially and rapidly. To give you some perspective, in 1910, there were about 94,000 Jews there, making up 13% of the population in Palestine, while by 1939, there were already 450,000 Jews, and they already made up 30% of the population of Palestine. This started generating conflict and violent reactions from Arab groups in the area, both in Jerusalem and in the outskirts. The conflict between Palestinians and Jews kept escalating until it erupted in 1936 in what is known as the Great Arab Revolt, which for 3 years would be a period of continuous uprisings and violent clashes, driven by the outrage of the Palestinians over the presence and behavior of the Jews in the area, all under the approval of the United Kingdom. This conflict would leave around 5,000 Palestinians dead, 3,000 Jews dead, and the British government in the area more discredited than ever. In the midst of this conflict, the British suggested in 1937 a possible plan to partition Palestine between an Arab state and a Jewish state. Ben-Gurion looked favorably on this measure, arguing that the most important thing was first to have a Jewish state in the region, regardless of the size at first, since the rest would come later. However, the war and the situation of the Jews in Europe affected the delicate situation in Palestine. Although when World War II began, the British tried to stop Jewish migration to Palestine and Jewish settlements in that region, Ben-Gurion, at the head of the Jewish Agency, the de facto government of the Jews in that territory, did everything possible to continue representing Jewish interests, strongly opposing British policies, and supporting Jewish migration. Legal or illegal, in the middle of the war, Ben-Gurion now begins to consider that the British were only delaying the Zionist project, and that the only possible solution with the Arabs was armed conflict. Even so, Ben-Gurion supports the participation of Jews in the British Army during the war and later on. However, after the war, Ben-Gurion would be criticized for putting more emphasis on the development of the Zionist project than on supporting European Jews during these years. Around this same time, Ben-Gurion takes advantage of the dramatic world scene to send numerous representatives of the Jewish Agency to exert influence and gain diplomatic support and economic resources for the years to come. It is around this same time that Ben-Gurion relies on an old friend named Golda Meir, about whom we have an interesting video that we invite you to watch on our channel. He proposes to her that she become the public face of the Zionist cause in the world, and that she be the one to raise funds in the years to come. The impressive sum of $50 million for the foundation of the State of Israel. Going back to the facts, after the end of the World War, with a deplorable domestic situation, with British government control severely weakened over the territory of the Palestine Mandate, with growing political and armed opposition from both Arabs and Jews, with attempts at civil war in the territory, and unable to stop Jewish migration, the British government began distancing itself from its responsibilities in the Palestine Mandate and started considering withdrawing from the area soon. It thus asks the United Nations organization to provide a solution for the entire complex situation in that region. So, on November 29, 1947, the United Nations passed Resolution number 181, also known as the Partition Plan, for Palestine, which stipulated the division of the territory into equal amounts of land, both for a Jewish state and for a Palestinian Arab state, and as a counterbalance to both states, an international zone administered by the United Nations in the city of Jerusalem. The plan is not well received by either group, but it is accepted by the Jewish Agency. However, the Arab leaders see it as the institutionalization of that state, which for them represented a threat to their existence in that area. And gathered in the so-called Arab Liberation Army and backed by the Arab League, they reject this plan which is why hostilities begin between them and the Haganah, that is, the Jewish paramilitary forces and militias, who were also preparing for an inevitable war, thus beginning what has been called the 1947 Civil War, a conflict that gradually becomes extremely violent, leaving numerous casualties. Ben-Gurion plays a fundamental role in directing military operations during this conflict, including the famous Dalet Plan of April 1948, which involves a strong offensive to occupy numerous Palestinian villages and expand the borders of the areas controlled by the Jews. Facing in addition a major event that was about to happen during the Civil War, the British authorities finally abandoned the territory, effectively ending the British Mandate of Palestine on May 14, 1948. On this same day, the authorities of the Jewish Agency, led by David Ben-Gurion, read and signed the formal Declaration of Independence of the so-called State of Israel from the United Kingdom, which was the former government of that area. That declaration, which seals the foundation of the first Jewish state in more than 2,000 years, ends up incorporating a new nation into the community of countries around the world. This new nation is quickly recognized by the United States and by the Soviet Union. Ben-Gurion, who at that time is nearly 62 years old, as the president of the Jewish Agency, he assumes de facto both the leadership of the nation's provisional government and the supreme command of the Haganah and the Jewish militias. Let us remember the new state is born in the midst of a state of war. The Declaration of Independence of Israel does not end the civil war with the Palestinian Arabs, but rather marks the beginning of another period of the same conflict, which would now become known as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, putting at stake the existence of the new state, in which David Ben-Gurion, as its leader, must carry out his first and crucial actions. As we told you, with the Declaration of Independence of Israel, the ongoing civil war turns into the Arab-Israeli War and takes on an international dimension. On the Israeli side, the newly created Israel Defense Forces, the actual army of the nation, are fighting, and the also newly created Institute for Intelligence and Special Operations, known by its acronym Mossad, whose creation is decreed and institutionalized by the head of government, Ben-Gurion. In addition to having the financial and diplomatic support of the ruling class of Great Britain, part of Europe, and the United States, for their part, the Palestinian Arabs fight in close alliance with Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and other member countries of the Arab League, which at first takes up the banner of the so-called Palestinian cause. Among the pro-Palestinian army is a 20-year-old young man named Yasser Arafat, about whom we have a video on our channel, and who in the years to come will become the undisputed representative of the Palestinian movement. This war, which took on an international connotation, was quite violent and deserves a separate video. It lasted a little over a year and formally ended in 1949, leaving around 6,300 casualties on the Israeli side and more than 10,000 casualties on the Palestinian side. The conflict ended with the State of Israel as the victor, which expanded its borders beyond the lines drawn by the 1947 partition plan. While the accepted international agreement had given 55% of the territory of the Palestine Mandate to the Jewish state, after the war, the Jews took control of approximately 78% of that territory. This war, which ended in 1948, also meant what the Arabs have called the First Nakba, or Palestinian catastrophe. During this period, more than 500,000 Palestinians fled their homes without the right to return, becoming permanent refugees in those years. Also, the Israeli armed forces occupied and destroyed around 500 Palestinian cities and towns, with the Nakba for some during that war being the virtual destruction of Palestinian society and homeland. This gave way to a process of expansion by the State of Israel, which did not end there, but continues to advance to this day. David Ben-Gurion, who until then had been the leader of the provisional government, was elected as the first prime minister of the State of Israel. In the first national elections held in 1949 since his party, Mapai won the majority of seats in the Knesset, that is, the Israeli parliament, according to the Israeli constitution. Although there is a president, he plays a more ceremonial role, since it is the prime minister who holds most of the political and executive power in the nation. For a period of 4 years, with the possibility of being re-elected indefinitely, Ben-Gurion's government was considerably pragmatic. It is one that is established amid great national and international controversy, and it is one in which the various national institutions are built to ensure the consolidation of the state of, while the notable problems of the moment are being dealt with, from the effective assimilation of Jewish migrants from all over the world to the confrontation with neighboring Arab groups, peoples, and countries who are largely opposed to the displacement of the Arab-Palestinian people and to the existence of the Israeli state. In this sense, Ben-Gurion promotes a massive immigration of Jews from Europe and the Arab world through the so-called Law of Return of 1950, and through special operations such as Operation Magic Carpet and Esdras and Nehemiah, with which he brings about 169,000 Jews from Yemen and Iraq. Economically, he adopts austerity economic policies and establishes new cities and agricultural settlements to integrate the newly arrived Jews. Ben-Gurion also named Jerusalem as the capital of the State of Israel in 1950. However, the international community still does not recognize this city as its capital. During his first term in the highest office, Ben-Gurion assigns General Ariel Sharon to launch the so-called reprisal operations, which are military incursions into territories outside their borders to combat Palestinian groups. This generated a lot of controversy after these events, such as the Kibbutz massacre in October 1953, in which Israeli forces killed up to 69 innocent civilians. Ben-Gurion ends his term in December 1953, being replaced by Moshe Sharet. Ben-Gurion, however, serves as acting prime minister during a visit by Sharet to the United States in 1955. In November of that same year, Ben-Gurion is re-elected once again by the parliament as prime minister, and it is a position he holds this second time until 1963, thanks to a re-election in 1959. His second term is one characterized by great economic and diplomatic prosperity for Israel, in which the new state asserts itself strongly in the Middle East. And in the concert of nations, Ben-Gurion transforms the Israeli economy into a tool to consolidate the independence and military power of this Israeli nation. Although he relaxes the severe austerity of the previous period, he maintains a prudent fiscal policy aimed at avoiding economic collapse, with a focus on strategic state investments in defense, infrastructure, and housing. This balance allows him to sustain economic growth without neglecting national security, which in the Israeli case was a matter of vital importance. In turn, Ben-Gurion promotes industrialization under a mixed economy model, strengthening sectors such as energy, transportation, and telecommunications, and expanding cities like Ashdod, which were a key part of the aforementioned plan to populate the Negev desert and decentralize the Israeli population. In addition, he signs cooperation agreements with France and West Germany, which not only strengthen defense but also provide vital financial support. Standing out in particular are the controversial German financial reparations from World War II, which were demanded by the State of Israel. He demands that the German state, controlled by the victorious Allied powers, pay war reparations to the Jews in Israel. These demands were accepted, and starting in 1952, large sums of money from the German treasury began to be paid to the State of Israel. This arrangement continued over the following decades, with German money becoming significant. In 1952, more than 80% of the Israeli state's tax revenue, due to the accelerated migration promoted by Biden, is experiencing an intense stage of cultural clash because of the continuous arrival of Jewish immigrants from various different regions of the world. Despite the government's efforts, day by day the differences between Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi Jews become more pronounced. Although they shared the same religion, each group had its own traditions and interpretations of it. This inequality is reflected in areas such as access to education, employment, and housing. Ben-Gurion, for his part, given his lack of interest in religion, focuses more on strengthening the state and on the issue of so-called social equity. This causes growing discontent among the Mizrahi Jewish communities. As several scholars point out, Ben-Gurion saw the emerging ethnic-religious conflict as something clearly secondary compared to the challenges of security, defense, and international legitimacy of the nascent state. For this reason, during his administration, he avoided deep social reforms and focused instead on functional integration, under the famous slogan of national fusion, which did not always correspond to the reality of the time. In turn, at the international level, Ben-Gurion's second term was not free of conflicts. The blockade of the Strait of Tiran and the nationalization of the Suez Canal by the Egyptian government of Gamal Abdel Nasser led Israel to invade the Sinai Peninsula, occupied by Egypt, in 1956, where certain Palestinian guerrillas were also operating. The United States halted the conflict by offering Israel a withdrawal in exchange for free navigation through the Red Sea, and the United Nations deployed its forces between Egypt and Israel to keep conflicts at bay in the following years. After this, Ben-Gurion became involved in fruitless talks with Arab leaders to achieve peace in the region. Even so, while calling for peace during his government, Israel began negotiations with France to obtain nuclear weapons around 1958. The nuclear issue would be fundamental for the development of the State of Israel and its security up to the present day, and it continues to generate major controversies. Another significant act for Ben-Gurion's prestige was the famous capture in Argentina of the former National Socialist officer Adolf Eichmann by the Mossad. In 1960, through a covert operation on Argentine soil for his subsequent trial and execution, Eichmann was accused of having been one of the main perpetrators of the mass persecution of Jews during the World War II, and his capture, violating Argentine sovereignty, generated great international debate, while in the Middle East, Arab and pan-Arab movements with a marked anti-Zionist rhetoric were emerging. Finally, by 1963, Ben-Gurion abruptly broke with his party, Mapai, whose leadership and support he lost due to apparently political issues and numerous rivalries within the party ranks. After this, Ben-Gurion, already 77 years old, resigned from the position of prime minister on June 21, 1963, thus stepping down from office, but not from politics. After leaving power, Ben-Gurion chose as his successor for the position of prime minister politician Levi Eshkol, with whom he soon became estranged due to personal differences. Finally, Ben-Gurion definitively separated from his party Mapai in 1965 when Eshkol won the election as party leader. As a result of this, Ben-Gurion created the opposition party called Rafi, which lost the parliamentary election that year. Thus, Ben-Gurion took the side of the opposition in parliament during the following years in Israel, creating several rivalries while criticizing certain actions of the government. In the face of the so-called Six-Day War, fought between Israel and a coalition of neighboring Arab countries in June 1967. In this conflict, Israel emerged victorious and took control of the Old City, also known as East Jerusalem, thus reunifying the capital. Ben-Gurion, for his part, always argued that this reunification was useless for Israel. The following year, in 1968, the Rafi party merged with the Mapai party, inciting Ben-Gurion to form another party, the so-called National List, which won only 4 seats in the 1969 elections. Already showing a politically weakened Ben-Gurion, these failures forced Ben-Gurion to retire from politics for good. In 1970, Ben-Gurion, already in his 80s, retired to live in the Sheda Boker kibbutz in the desert, For the time being, David devoted himself to writing his memoirs and other works of history and chronicles, as well as biblical studies and the publication of essays and other collections of historical material. David Gruen, who renamed himself and is known in history as David Ben-Gurion, at the age of 87 suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died suddenly at Tel HaShomer Hospital on December 1, 1973. Hemorrhage December, David suffers David at the place HaShomer, place of Gruen. David is at David's house. Hospital in the hospital of Israel. In the hospital of Israel. Hospital of Israel. In the hospital of Israel. In the hospital of. In the hospital of Israel. In the one of Israel. In the hospital of Israel. Fiction for the Zionist cause? Although he was not religious at all, the connection he felt with his ancestral culture, with the Jewish religion, and with the Hebrew language, spoken today as a common language in Israel, when in his youth it was hardly spoken. They forever marked the way he conducted himself throughout his life and the very formation of the State of Israel. The same one that, despite the time that has passed, still gives people plenty to talk about. Thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video and remind you that your support means a lot to us. Always by sharing the content, leaving your comments, liking the video, turning on the notification bell, and interacting with the channel in general. Thank you all, and may God bless you.